We don't like the hype cycle, we like the fact cycle.
Die Geldmeisterin. Der Finanzpodcast. Mit Julia Kistner.
Und mit Raj Shant, Managing Director bei Jennison Associates, ein Unternehmen des US-amerikanischen Vermögensverwaltungsgiganten PGIM, der trotz der steigenden Zinsen innovative Wachstumsaktien bei den Bewertungen derzeit spannend findet. Denn sie würden weiterhin durch den Superzyklus bei Innovationen beflügelt. Dieser Superzyklus sieht Raj Shant etwa in den Bereichen digitaler Zahlungsverkehr, Direktvermarktung mit eigenen Shops oder auch Online-Shopping oder auch bei Cloud-Lösungen. Wir erleben derzeit keine zweite Tech-Bubble, unterstreicht Raj Shant, das sei absurd. Im Gegensatz zur Dotcom-Zeit nämlich wachsen viele innovative Tech-Unternehmen weiter und schreiben Gewinne. Mehr möchte ich hier nicht verraten.
You said that innovations will prolong the growth cycles. Which kind of innovations?
I think if you look at the world today and over the last 5-10 years, there are so many big innovations going on in the world. And so there's a sort of, if you like, an innovation super cycle. And so let me give you some examples of the big long-term innovations we see now that we think will carry on for many years. So you can put them into groups or baskets of innovations. So the first would be things like the direct-to-consumer. So think about big brands. They generally now want to go direct to the consumer. If they sell through other people's shops, they don't know what image is being projected, they don't get the price point, but most importantly, they don't get to know the customer who is buying my product. So take the example of a big company like Nike. Nike has been investing a lot of money building its own stores, which is direct to consumer, but more importantly, building its website and building its delivery and fulfillment abilities so that they can offer things directly to consumers everywhere. And in return, what they get is not just more control of their brand, more control of pricing, they also get knowledge of the consumer. So they look at you and they say, she bought running shoes. What else did she look at before she hit the buy button on buying the running shoes? And so they can get a good profile for who's interested in what. They can get a good profile for what price points might they be interested in the future for new products and new promotions. And so then they can make things that satisfy their customers better. So direct to consumer is a very powerful trend. And that's, you can see that in big companies like Nike, where nearly 40% of their sales are directly to the consumer, and that's growing much faster than their sales through other channels. You can see that through e-commerce. So is Amazon big in Austria? Yeah. So in Europe, much of Europe, Amazon is the direct-to-consumer e-commerce experience. If you live in Southeast Asia, most likely you're going to use a brand called Shopee, which is owned by a listed company, listed in Singapore called Sea Limited. And of course, if you live in Latin America, it's different again. You're most likely to use a brand called Mercado Libre, a company called Mercado Libre. And again, these companies, they were doing incredibly well. The innovation was already there before the pandemic. And the pandemic came and we were all locked in our homes and we had to use e-commerce. But guess what? It's cheaper, it's more convenient, it's more flexible, you've got more choice. You know, you get better value for money. You can check what kind of value for money you're getting. So, of course, during the pandemic, whether you were in Europe or the US, whether you were in Asia, whether you were in Latin America, you suddenly saw the value, the value proposition of this kind of e-commerce. And people aren't going back. This is going to be a long-term growth area. Related to this direct-to-consumer is digital payments. Huge growth in digital payments. So, if you think about the last 30, 40 years, we've gradually, slowly been moving from cash to digital payments. I mean, that's still a very long journey to completely replace cash in the system. But actually, there's a huge amount of business opportunities in that. So these companies have grown to enable e-commerce, digital commerce. So digital commerce, we think, is growing very rapidly, but even more rapidly now than it was before the pandemic. But this is still a structural innovation that's been underway for a long time. But even if you think about the luxury goods companies, the Hermes, the Louis Vuittons, people used to say they will never do direct to consumer. They must have the very expensive shops in Vienna airport, in the big airports around the world. But guess what? They can, and they do. So they will still have their prestige shop in the centre of Paris, in the centre of New York. They'll still have a prestige shop in the airport. But if you happen to live in a secondary city in one of those countries, you can still buy online the items that you saw in the flagship store. So the stores, the physical stores, are becoming fewer and grander. But then actually a lot more of the sales, the actual selling goods to someone, getting the revenue through the door, is being done online. If you want to buy the luxury pen, the luxury bag, the luxury shoes, you can now buy them whenever you want and they'll be delivered to your door. It's a great proposition.
And what is also pushing this? Is it the metaverse story? Is this also...
Good question. We don't think so. So, the metaverse exists, and for a certain number of companies and a certain number of people, it is important, and it may become more important. But actually, when the pandemic ended, or when the lockdown, we still have a bit of the pandemic, don't we? When the restrictions ended, people didn't say, no, let me spend more and more time online. They actually want to be with other people. When Mark Zuckerberg was promoting the metaverse, the examples he used, at least personally to me, but most people, I think, who looked at it, were not inspiring. So your friends have gone to a music concert, and then you can join them virtually. And you can share the fun. I'm not sure how appealing that is. But we think that really that might be all this talk about the metaverse might be a response to understanding or seeing a business dynamic for Facebook, which maybe had been hidden in the previous years. And that is that actually they're a product which doesn't control its own distribution. They're not direct to their consumers. Because actually, Apple control most of their distribution. And when Apple introduced new privacy rules, not allowing apps to track people across different applications, suddenly Facebook have to come up with something different, because their products of the advertising companies was, look, I know more about each user than they maybe even know about themselves. Because I see all their personal messages, I see every app they go to, every website they go to. Now, because of Apple, that's stopped. So they need some new ideas on their business. So we're not sure about the metaverse. We wouldn't be investing into that kind of idea yet. Maybe that will change.
That's an interesting point. In which stadium of the hype cycle are you investing?
We don't like the hype cycle. We like the fact cycle.
Okay.
I mean, if you think about companies There's a lot of talk of, especially recently when there was a rotation in the stock markets, out of growth stocks, there's a lot of talk of, this is like the technology bubble. No. Utter nonsense. In the technology bubble, the big leadership companies, the biggest stock market companies, had no profits. They had no cash flow. And indeed, some of them had no revenues. They were just an idea in someone's head. Look at it now. Companies like Apple, companies like Amazon, they generate huge amounts of revenues, huge amounts of profits and cash flows. Far, far more as a percentage of the overall market than, say, the industrials or the banks or the insurers. So these are actually cash generative, profitable companies. So to compare it to the technology bubble is literally absurd. A bubble is when there is hardly anything there. In fact, the South Sea bubble. They were selling shares in a company which would control the trade to the South Seas and make profits in unknown ways. So the biggest companies in the technology space these days, they aren't like that. You can see the revenues, you can see the profits and the cash flow, and they grow. They grow strongly. A lot of these industrial companies, a lot of cyclicals and value companies have zero growth or negative growth over a full economic cycle. So the valuations are higher, but that's because you're actually getting something that will be bigger in 3 to 5 years' time, substantially bigger in many cases. When you buy a traditional industrial company or indeed an oil company, fundamentally many of them do the same thing today that they did 10, 20, and in the case of some of the oil companies, 30, 40 years ago. They dig some carbon-related fossil fuels out of the ground and they sell them to people. Where is the value added? Where is the intellectual property? Where is the innovation in that? They can do it a bit cheaper and faster. But that's why over a cycle they don't grow. They barely earn their cost of capital in the good times. And the bad times, they make big losses.
So where do you find these innovations? You just said in shopping, and then in e-commerce, are there other
digital payments?
areas?
Yes, absolutely. So it's good to bring me back to the point. Well done.
I'm sorry, but you're 40 minutes.
Digital or direct-to-consumer is a big theme. It's not just about technology. It's about taking ownership of your own stores, taking ownership of how your brand is presented to the public. And then digital payments is really an attachment of that. But that's growing beyond just digital commerce because, there's a huge disruption possible here. If you think about the big banks, and maybe Austria's different, but I'll talk about the UK and other European markets where the banks still make a lot of money.
With margin.
Essentially, they're moving your money from point A to point B. Sometimes they do it very slowly. Sometimes you can't even get them to do it because they won't offer people accounts. They offer controlled access. And then for that simple movement of money, they'll then take a big fee for it. Technology can change that. Technology can do that for not zero cost, but zero marginal cost. Obviously, there's a cost of building a technology platform. So fintech is really an area of great opportunity, but probably
don't make money yet.
Some don't, but some are close to making money. If they stopped investing so aggressively for growth, they would be making lots of money already. But less so in Austria or the UK, less so in Europe, because actually, where are the biggest, most inefficient, laziest, if you like, banks? It's emerging markets. Right, so they'll make it hard for you to get access, much harder than in Austria or the UK. So a lot of people can't even get a bank account. and then they'll charge you far more for moving your money from point A to point B, and they'll do it far slower. But for a disruption to be very profitable, that's what you need, is legacy companies that are very fat, very lazy, a big profit pool that's already there. So we do think that in these, you could call them fintechs, but you could call them digital first banks. You could call them neobanks. The basic premise is that they must have decided that they're going to lead first with technology, and that the branches and other forms of banking will probably exist in some form. They still have to have a branch or two, but they don't need expensive real estate on every high street of every town and every city in the country. So they exist and they're growing and they're flourishing in many places, but we think the ones that stand the best chance of being really profitable in some of the emerging markets. So there's opportunities there. And then also the enabling technologies. So enabling,
for example?
So enabling other companies to digitize, to move expensive software servers, expensive servers from their physical premises onto the cloud.
Can I think of Shopify or something like this? Or what do you mean?
A very good example, but we do like Shopify for the long term, but we would think that is more of the direct-to-consumer enabler.
Okay.
So just like Adyen in Holland as well, digital payments, they enable other companies to move direct to the consumer. And Shopify is a brilliant, brilliant example of that. You know, you and I could set up a company tomorrow. We then go to Shopify, we can get our website, we can get them to do fulfillment and deliveries, they'll handle our payments, all for a fee. But of course, you know, if it's a good idea, we can actually address a huge market very, very quickly. And actually, if you take all those companies on the Shopify platform together, it is they who will be the biggest challenger to Amazon. Not the regulators, not the politicians. It's this massive ecosystem of all these companies doing it themselves, doing different things, but on that Shopify platform.
Achtung, Shopify hat seit Jahresbeginn 73% verloren und ist dezidiert keine Anlageempfehlung. Ich persönlich glaube an das Unternehmen, weshalb ich die Aktie weiterhin in meinem Portfolio mit hohen Verlusten halte. Aber ich persönlich finde das aktuelle Börsenumfeld nicht für das Richtige, jetzt viel zu riskieren. Für neue Investments würde ich mich derzeit auf die großen, wenig verschuldeten Tech-Unternehmen konzentrieren, wie Microsoft, Amazon oder Alphabet, die auch an den innovativen Superzyklen teilhaben, die Raj Shant aufzählt. Derzeit noch nicht trauen würde ich mich in die kleinen, innovativen Unternehmen in diesen Bereichen, die das nächste Big Thing sein könnten. Raj nennt sie Next Generation in Growth, auf die man schauen muss. Giants of Tomorrow. Ganz einfach deshalb nicht, weil ich glaube, dass zu viele von ihnen die Luft ausgehen wird, wenn die Zinsen noch weiter steigen und auch an der Börse kein Geld mehr von Specs zu holen ist, von den Börsenhüllen, die Startups lange Zeit großzügig sponserten. Aus Specs wird selbst das Geld abgezogen. Aber jetzt zurück zu Raj.
Now, so I would say companies like Shopify, companies like Adyen, they're all part of that direct-to-consumer. You can see how broad and big that direct-to-consumer theme is. But I want to move on to a different kind of a super cycle, which is moving computing power from servers in your offices to the cloud. So why is that so helpful? Why is that so good? So basically, in the old days, if you go back 15 years or 20 years, you know, if you and I wanted to build a business and we wanted to run applications, we wanted to run a website, we wanted to run a client relations a database, we might need our own servers. But that's not our strength. Our strength might be, you know, selling design and products to people. So we've got to choose servers. And then we've got to get IT people to help us choose them, to install them, and then to run them you need a whole team of IT people. and to avoid cyber hacking of all our valuable data. We then need data security people who need to keep updating all of that. If we move it onto the cloud, we don't have to choose the server. We don't have to choose the software. We can sign up to the security service of the cloud.
So you prefer the cloud providing companies. So then you should take Amazon and Microsoft. So you have both. You have cloud providing and you have e-commerce.
Yes, and we do. Yes, we like both of those. We believe that the leaders in cloud infrastructure are enabling all these other companies in every other sector of the economy to digitize, to really be able to benefit from the full value of the computing revolutions we've seen. And there have been many. You know, the key to remember is that Moore's law says that computing power will double roughly every 18 months. Which is huge, right? And that's why the cost of computing, the power of computing keeps growing so rapidly. But if you and I had to choose the servers to put in our premises, we had to choose which software, we had to recruit special people to do all the security, that slows everything down. If we can outsource that to Amazon Web Services, if we can outsource that to Microsoft Azure or to the Google Cloud, if we grow threefold next year, they will offer us the bigger computing power. We don't have to go out and choose the latest servers and make decisions we're not equipped to make.
And what are the companies or the sectors you think they drive the innovation? Is it just tech titles, or you just mentioned at the beginning there are classical retail companies like Nike? They also have the opportunity to be part of this innovation. Or what companies you are looking at?
You're absolutely right in the way that you asked that question, because what it is it's enabling, it's technology being transformed, metamorphosing into something that can democratize all these new opportunities. And that basically is spreading through sector after sector of the economy. So the tech titans arguably are the leaders in cloud infrastructure. That's the Amazon Web Services, that's the Microsoft Azure, that's the Google Cloud. And even in China, although we don't invest in it, the Barber Cloud, etc. But then within that, you've got specialist companies that are only focusing on database management as a software as a service companies. Now they're much smaller, and they're creating entirely new industries, and the whole company effectively only exists on the cloud. These companies can grow triple digit because they're starting from a small base and they're growing massively, and you can get them in database. We're not involved there. You can get them in sales management, client database management. We're not directly involved there. You can also get them for security, because obviously if you're on the cloud and you've got people using that cloud application in all different locations, new security risks. We are involved with that because that's a hugely growing business area. So the cloud infrastructure companies tend to be more mature and profitable today. In the next few years, we think the software as a service companies will start to mature and make more profits and cash flows, but at the moment they don't. So we're watching them very carefully, but possibly a bit early to invest at that stage of development, especially in the environment of rising interest rates, because many of these companies still don't have a profit. So we don't get so involved with that stage at the moment, but we think that will be very profitable in the future.
Because you were talking about the fact cycle, not the hype cycle.
Yeah.
So do they have already earnings or?
We generally will prefer companies with very strong profits and cash flows. But from time to time, you have to invest in companies where they are investing a lot of today's profits and cash flows for future growth. Now, at a time when interest rates are rising, you may have less of those kind of companies where they are investing all their profits and all their cash flow for the future growth, because it has more of an impact if the real profits and cash flows. So, at a time of the cycle like this, quality growth where you've got the profits and cash flows here, and more of it is visible today, is probably a better place to be than the super growth, super high multiple kind of part of the market. But fundamentally, we think it's important to always be looking at the next generation of growth. Those companies that are growing strongest today were nowhere 10, 15 years ago. Those companies that will be the biggest drivers of your returns, your investment portfolios 5 years from now, 10 years from now, we might never have heard of many of them today. And it's because they invest, it's because they grow, that they become the giants of tomorrow.
So you're looking for the giants of tomorrow, or did I get you right and you don't invest in, let's say, Google or Amazon, but you prefer to invest in the next generation of giants?
Okay, so I should clarify because I don't think I've been very clear. So for our Global Equity Opportunities Fund, we are by and large investing in the giants of today who still have a lot of growth. So if you look at Amazon's cloud infrastructure business, it's growing at more than 40% per annum at the moment. If you look at Microsoft Azure, it's growing more than 40% per annum and looks like it will carry on growing like that for many years. Look at the Google Cloud business, it's growing at 40% plus per annum. Show me a bank or an insurance company or an oil company that's growing at that kind of rate ever in the last 100 years, and I'll be amazed. So in the Global Equity Opportunities strategy, we are focused on that quality end, and we're just looking at software as a service and some of these young, exciting but very high valuation companies. We do have a UCITS fund, which is called the Next Generation Fund, which is for small and mid-cap companies, where we are looking for the giants of tomorrow. And that obviously comes with some greater volatility, but it also comes with greater rewards, because when these companies are succeeding, they are growing at such a fantastic rate. And that's obviously why people invest in that kind of strategy, because clearly, from week to week or month to month, it will look more volatile. It will be more volatile. And so, if you invest in that, you should not be looking at it from 1 week to the next or from 1 month to the next. We don't know what the key growth companies 3 years from now will be, but we know there will be some. It's only a small number of companies that drive all the innovation and all the growth, and they're the ones who earn an excess return. If you want to invest in a company that's doing pretty much what it did 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years ago, you can, but you won't get a supernormal return. Over a cycle, they don't make more than their cost of capital. Oil companies, they're commoditized. Mining companies, they're commoditized. Banks, they're commoditized. You don't care who lends you the money to buy your flat or your home. So you'll go to whoever offers it cheapest. So what we look for are more innovative companies, because we believe that they can drive their own growth by innovating, sometimes by disrupting. They can drive their own growth. Now, we don't pretend that we can tell you today who the great growth drivers will be in 2025. That is arrogance and foolishness, because a lot of times the innovation comes from industries and sectors you wouldn't expect. It might be the kind of companies you wouldn't expect. So what we look for is, where is that growth beginning to come through? And the best indication of that is not waiting for profits. Because the best growth companies, by the time they've turned profitable, some of them, not all of them, some of the giants are still very profitable, a lot of them have gone past their best growth. So you have to be willing to be flexible, and you look at revenue growth, you look at market share growth to identify where the growth is. Now we run several strategies. We have a global equity strategy, we have a global next generation, so that's a small and mid-cap strategy. We have an emerging market equity strategy and a US large cap growth strategy. They're all looking for growth in different ways in different parts of the market. So growth can take many forms. It can be the large cap, more mature, but still strong growth. But then if you're willing to look at the small and mid caps, you get higher rates of growth. Companies at an earlier stage of their growth cycle that maybe have much higher multiples sometimes, often, but will also come with much higher returns. If you go to the emerging markets, you have a different opportunity set again. As I was saying, fintech doesn't make much money and we think maybe has a mixed opportunity set in Europe or America. But in the emerging markets where the banks and the insurance companies are so inefficient, there's some really interesting opportunities in banking, in insurance, and they don't have to be a technology company. So often in many of those markets, they can be an existing bank or an insurance company that's understood that the way to really grow is to be digital first. And that insight means that they stop investing in or even sell their properties on the high streets of these towns and cities, and they invest instead in reaching the consumers directly. So it's also another direct-to-consumer kind of model, but through apps on the phone, through the website, less so through the phone, and even less so through a small number of branches to support people who really can't do it any other way. But growth is valuable and it's scarce. Most companies that you look at, most companies we come into contact with in our everyday lives, just like most human beings, are pretty ordinary. They don't wake up each day saying, right, how can I be extraordinary today? What can I do today that's totally different from everyone else? No. The chief execs of the majority of companies wake up thinking, how can I make sure I still have my job at the end of the year? So they're not thinking, what is the unmet need in my industry? How can I re-engineer the entire architecture, the cost architecture, the product architecture, to deliver something that's more convenient and more flexible and cheaper and better value for my clients? So a small number of companies wake up only to do that every day, and they're the ones we look for. You can find them anywhere in the world, but only a small number of them. So that's not profits, that's not necessarily cash flows, but we have to be able to see how the profits and the cash flow will come about within the next, say, 2, 3, 4 year time horizon.
So for you, the fundamentals are very important, and the track record from this CEO, or where are you finding this company?
The track record of the management is important. Execution is very, very important. But literally to drive on the road, looking in the backward mirror, you're going to have a crash. You can't afford to do that. So what we have for these growth products that I've just mentioned is a team of dedicated sector analysts. A growth analyst, the sector analyst, has to look at the company and say, right, what is it doing that's really different to other companies, that's not been done before? So they're already, the value in analysis and the growth analysis are completely different. It's something new that's not been done before. for the growth investor, for the growth analyst. And then they've got to work out how big is the potential market, the addressable market for this growth idea. And then they've got to work out what the potential profitability of that would be.
Just one last question. How do you handle the inflation and the higher interest rates, which really keeps the life difficult for growth companies?
The end of 2021, so once the Federal Reserve said, we are no longer just about supporting growth, we're actually going to focus on bringing inflation down. It caused a big rotation, a very violent rotation out of growth stocks in December, all of December, and then all of January, and then early February it was beginning to fade when the Russian invasion of the Ukraine happened, and that caused oil prices and food prices, and it's still causing them to go up more. And so the market rotated again out of these growth companies into energy stocks and commodity companies. So actually what you have now is a situation where the valuations of a lot of the growth companies have gone back, relative to the rest of the market, they're back to where they were at the end of 2019. As if the pandemic never happened. As if the very rapid growth in adoption, the very rapid growth in revenues and profits has never happened. If you look back over previous growth cycles, you'll see that growth companies tend to outperform value companies in rising interest rate cycles. Why is that? It's because once you start seeing interest rates increasing, so all the underperformance of growth stocks tends to happen, or most of it tends to happen before the first rate increase by the US Federal Reserve. Once the rate increases have begun, the market stops focusing on when will they raise rates, how much will they raise rates by, the path of the interest rate increases, and it starts to focus on the intention of the interest rate increases. What is the intention of these rate increases? It's to slow the general economy down. It's to suck some aggregate demand out of the system. That doesn't affect how many iPhones are going to be sold next year. It doesn't affect how much e-commerce and digital transactions take place next year. It's much more about the general aggregate demand. That affects your value companies and your cyclicals much more. As secular growth actually starts to look better because actually a lot of those traditional companies face downward earnings revisions, and steady growth companies start to look much more attractive again.
So you are the one who are looking forward to rising interest rates?
Not in my mortgage payments, but yes, as an investor, yes.
Über aktuelle Börsenaufreger und Ereignisse berichtet Werktag für Werktag übrigens die kleine Podcast-Schwester der Geldmeisterin, die Börsenminute. Überall, wo es Podcasts gibt, auf YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, Xing und auch auf www.geldmeisterin.com. Eine erfolgreiche Anlagewoche wünscht euch die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner. Und am Schluss noch der Disclaimer. An dieser Stelle wie immer der wichtige Hinweis, dass die Inhalte dieses Podcasts, der Videos und der Webseite geldmeisterin.com ausschließlich der allgemeinen Information dienen und die ganz persönliche Meinung der Geldmeisterin und von Julia sind. Es handelt sich keinesfalls um Investmentempfehlungen, Rechts- oder Anlageberatungen. Das Gesagte, Geschriebene und Dargestellte kann und soll auch nicht das persönliche Gespräch mit deiner Finanzberaterin ersetzen. Auch sind weder die Geldmeisterin noch Julia Kistner informiert darüber, wie es mit deiner Vermögenssituation ausschaut, deinen Bedürfnissen, familiären Umständen, deinem Finanzwissen, die Risikoneigung oder deinen Anlagehorizont. Anlegen erfolgt daher auf eigene Gefahr. Die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner haften nicht für Anlageentscheidungen, die aufgrund ihrer Medienbeiträge getroffen werden. Kurzum, für die Geldmeisterin und Julia Kistner war es immer ein Vergnügen, dich bei deinem Vermögensaufbau zu inspirieren. Auf deinen eigenen, persönlich richtigen Geldesel musst du schon selbst setzen. Viel Erfolg!